I wrote this book on NATO's secret armies. It's been translated in 10 languages, and I spent 4 years of my life to research NATO. As a Swiss historian, I look from NATO from a country on NATO which is outside of it. Okay, Switzerland is not part of NATO. And I found out that NATO was formed in 1949, and I found a very interesting quote by US President Richard Nixon. He once said, quote, "NATO is the only international organization which works, and this is because it's a military organization and because America is in charge." So, end of quote. If you look at NATO, really, it means that you have the biggest military organization on earth, okay? So the peace movement must actually look at NATO. Otherwise, you don't see the elephant in the room. And secondly, you have to ask yourself, who is in charge? And the answer is very clear. NATO is dominated by the Pentagon, by the United States. Then the second question the peace movement has to ask, is NATO defensive or offensive? And now there are two parts to this questions. You have to look at NATO in the historical context. From 1949 until 1991, so that's during the Cold War, NATO was largely, I'm not saying totally, but I'm saying largely a defensive organization. That means during that time period, NATO did not attack or bomb any other country. It was basically a network of countries which were opposing the so-called Warsaw Pact, which was led by Moscow and Russia. So Russia had its own defense alliance, which was the Warsaw Pact, and America had its own defense alliance, which was NATO. And so they basically stood next to each other and looked each other in the eye, but didn't, kill each other. Then, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Cold War ended. That was in 1991. And that meant that NATO should have been dissolved right then and there, okay? Because the official enemy evaporated. It no longer existed, okay? NATO always said, we have to be here because the Warsaw Pact is here. But when the Warsaw Pact evaporated, NATO said, okay, this threat is gone, but there are many, many other threats. So unfortunately, we cannot, dissolve NATO. So what we then saw is that NATO, first of all, took part of Germany into the NATO structure. You have to remember that Germany during the Cold War was split in two parts, okay? There was Western Germany and there was Eastern Germany. Eastern Germany, called DDR, was part of the Warsaw Pact. So the Russians actually had troops in the DDR. And Gorbachev then agreed to withdraw these troops back to Moscow without firing a shot. And he agreed that NATO could be enlarged with this little bit of Germany. Okay, so now all of Germany is part of NATO. But Gorbachev and Bush at the time were talking about, that the Russians don't like NATO very much and they don't want NATO very close to the Russian borders. So what then happened is that US Foreign Secretary Baker promised Gorbachev that NATO is not going to move 1 inch, okay, closer to Moscow. But then, unfortunately, in the 1990s, NATO expanded, broke its promise, and new countries like Poland, like Estonia, Latvia, Romania, Bulgaria, many others, were integrated into NATO. So NATO has become much, much bigger. It's now 28 countries big, and it's really close to the Soviet border. So people ask, did NATO ever in its history attack another sovereign country? And the answer is yes. This began in 1999 when NATO bombed Serbia. Okay, Serbia is a sovereign country which did not attack any NATO country. So very strange that NATO suddenly changes from a defensive alliance to an offensive alliance. But this is what happened. It really happened. And people should wake up to this fact and say, gee, if NATO is an offensive alliance, then maybe we shouldn't have NATO, because we don't need more wars, really. We have more than enough violence already. So in 1999, this started, and NATO countries bombed Serbia. The Germans participated, the French participated, the Americans, of course, the British, of course. So, they all together bombed Serbia, and this was illegal. It was a war of aggression. Thereafter, in 2001, the terrorist attacks of 9/11 happened, which are very mysterious, to say the least. But let's just stick to what NATO did then. NATO said, this is an attack on NATO territory, which is true, okay? New York is in the United States, and the United States are NATO territory. So that was the first time NATO said, oh, NATO is under attack. And, rightly so. But then the question was, who carried out this terrorist attack? Until this very day, there are many, many different questions and theories, and we don't really know what happened on 9/11. And NATO said, oh, we know who carried out this terrorist attack. These were the people from Afghanistan, terrorists who lived there, led by Osama bin Laden. So already on 7 October 2001, that was not even a month after the terrorist attack, NATO invaded Afghanistan. Okay, first they bombed Serbia, then they invade Afghanistan. That was never the plan of NATO. It was never the plan to have NATO all over the world bombing other countries. So that's another illegal war of aggression, because there was no UN mandate to invade Afghanistan. People then hoped, oh, let's hope NATO's going to calm down, and Serbia and Afghanistan were just two countries NATO knocked out so in a rage, and hopefully it's going to relax and not attack many more countries. But this was not the case. In 2003, the British and the Americans, both NATO members, attacked Iraq. So, it all went on and on and on. In 2011, NATO country France, together with NATO countries UK and the British and the Danish and quite a few others, started to bomb Libya, 2011. And at the same time, in 2011, NATO secretly, that was not obviously declared, started to fund terrorists in Syria to overthrow the government of Bashar al-Assad. They didn't call them terrorists, by the way. They said, these are freedom fighters, and we need to support them because they are having a just struggle against a brutal dictatorship. So really, NATO has changed completely from a defensive alliance to an offensive alliance. NATO is a danger to world peace, and we should really think about what NATO has done in the last years. And if we want to have a reality check, we must just look at the countries which were bombed by NATO. We can look at Afghanistan. The country is destroyed in many parts. We can look at Iraq, destroyed in many parts. People traumatized, people killed. More than 1 million people died in Iraq war since 2003. So we can look at Libya, another mess. Really, if you look at NATO, what they leave behind is not very constructive. So that's why I'm a critic of NATO. I don't think that this is the best that we can do. I think NATO has a military budget of $900 billion. So that's 9 zeros for the billions, 2 zeros for the 900. That makes it 11 zeros. A 9 and 11 zeros. That's the military budget of the NATO countries. 600 billions alone is the US. And the opponents of NATO are Russia, China. What's the military budget of the Russians? $90 billion. So that's, 10 times smaller. So NATO really is the elephant in the room.